I'll start with Graham. Graham on the end. Graham MacFadyen works for the British Library, where he's head of digital and marketing operations. Welcome, Graham. I've got Mark Palmer, who's consultant to the board at Pret A Manger, until very recently group marketing director. He's also got other interests. He's the co-founder of drinks brand Corsten Press and a non-exec on Union Handcrafted Coffee, which I'm hoping most of you have probably enjoyed over the last couple of days at the various points during the festival. And I got Tom Davies, who is the priority campaigns manager at Amnesty International. I'm going to start with you, Tom, if I could. Amnesty won an award this year, a Marketing Society Award for shoestring marketing. And of course, being who you are, working for a charitable institution, I guess you work with the shortest of all short strings. In terms of the award, you had a £15,000 budget, I believe. But what you did manage to do is extract the absolute maximum outcome from a relatively small amount of money. Can I ask you firstly to sort of talk us through what you did and what your objectives were and what you achieved?
Sure. Thanks, Russell. So just to give a bit of context, I'm a campaign manager at Amnesty. The campaign I was running last year, it's a 2-year campaign, 2014-2015, was a campaign to stop torture. And so a kind of core issue for Amnesty and our supporters. Now, one of the key objectives that I set for that campaign, in terms of the wider campaign, was to close bear with me here, close the loopholes in the law at an EU level that prohibit the trade in torture equipment. And those loopholes allow people within Europe to get round the absolute prohibition of torture in order to advertise, for example, advertise torture equipment or broker a deal for torture equipment. As long as that torture equipment was not produced in the EU, or as long as that torture equipment did not enter the EU physically, it wasn't illegal for EU companies, individuals, to advertise the fact that they could produce torture equipment and sell it, or make the deal and reap the reward. So, for example, in a nutshell, something could produce in China, exported to, say, Nigeria or Democratic of the Congo, person sitting in Paris, Brussels, wherever, on the phone, on the email, doing the deal, makes the money as long as it doesn't enter the EU. So that's the context in which we're operating in. Second bit of context is that every 2 years, not far from here, there's a massive arms fair called the DSEI Arms Fair. It happens in the Docklands. And what we had found by going both officially and undercover into those arms fairs, at 4 of the previous 5 arms fairs, torture equipment had been on offer in catalogues and they're available for sale, either torture equipment or other illegal banned goods such as cluster bombs. So we had 2 objectives really for the campaign that we were going to run. One was to get the UK government to really clamp down on what's happening immediately at the arms fair and to raise attention to that. And then secondly, the wider campaign objective to try and close these loopholes. So we really wanted to generate a buzz about the arms fair. It's a little known issue really, perhaps outside of London, or if you read certain types of media, that it was even existed, let alone that there was torture equipment that might be available there. So the timing was key. There was the arms fair coming up. We decided to strategically prioritise that. We did have a small budget, as Russell said, 15k. We did top it up with another 5k for ads on social. For context for us, it was actually a bigger budget than we would normally spend on such campaigns because we saw this coming together as being a great opportunity. We also had the offer of a creative agency called VCCP, who had approached us earlier in the year offering to work for us pro bono. So we knew that there was an opportunity to work with them, we knew that we could engage with them, and we decided this was the right issue to work with them on. So we decided to come up with, collectively, in terms of our creative idea, creative concept, an advertising campaign for the arms fair on behalf of the UK government. So the UK government formally supports that arms fair, and we thought, well, how better to draw attention to it than to basically run a spoof campaign. So we placed physical adverts in the media, so topical media, relevant media, the Metro, the Standard, City AM. We had out-of-home street adverts, digital adverts. We put ads on social media. We created a spoof advertising film for that arms fair. We physically got people onto the street in order to, dressed up in, we had official-looking lanyards, placards, a T-shirt that said, London Arms Fair, unofficial helper, and hand out flyers and say, do you know you can get torture equipment just 20 minutes from here down the road? And we really engaged with our existing supporters, both on social and also through our email list that we'd been engaging with on the issue of torture. The audience we decided to target for this was young optimists. So we thought 18 to 35, people who are engaging politically but and maybe taking action, might see themselves as social activists, but not necessarily with us as Amnesty. And their way of taking action would be sharing content. So we looked to produce content that would meet their needs. Can we show the film? Can we show the film? Is it possible to show the film? You don't have a film? Fine.
The best laid plans, forgive me.
So you don't have it at all, or you can't locate it right now? Nope, fine, don't worry.
Okay.
So we produced, don't worry.
Let's get past.
We produced a 40-second film with artwork by Anthony Burrell. It was bold, it was bright, it had things like, as well as grenades, tanks, whatever, rocket launchers. You might also find offers of illegal torture equipment and cluster bombs. And it was all done as animation. It had little quirks like just off the A13 near Dagenham. It was basically quite a funny, engaging film. You can look it up on our Amnesty website. The URL we produced was tortureonyourdoorstep.co.uk. So unbranded, by the way, all the films, not branded as Amnesty. I was hoping you'd watch the film. You can't. I'll just give you a quick overview of some stats and then and the impact, then I'll hand over. So in terms of the print and online media reach, we had 34.6 million people exposed to it. We got independent coverage. We also, put out traditional press release about the story. So we also got into The Guardian, The Mirror, Independent, The Standard, picked up in places like BuzzFeed, etc. We really targeted Facebook and social ads on Facebook for people that had a similar interest to these issues or supported similar organizations, And that reached over 3 million people on Facebook alone and 500,000 views on Facebook, including 100,000 click-throughs. Now, in terms of actual impact for me as a campaign manager, what I wanted was that the government would notice. And we had a response from the government, I've got it here, addressed to our director. And in that letter, it said, I'll quote a couple of things from the following: acknowledging the very large number of emails from members of the public responding to Amnesty's Torture on Your Doorstep campaign, which was evidence of the strength of feeling on the issue. So that was a key thing. We wanted to show the government that people cared about this and were concerned about it and wanted to do something about it. And secondly, acknowledging that the UK government supports many of Amnesty's recommendations to close these loopholes and pledge to continue to work with us in order to further strengthen these laws. And finally, it's very topical to be sat here speaking to you now because 2 days ago in, Brussels, I think it was Strasbourg in fact, on Tuesday, 4th of October, the European Parliament voted to close many of those loopholes that we had identified, including both the advertising and brokering of torture equipment. So as a campaign manager, it really, really, really did the job.
Well, that's the ultimate return on investment. I almost feel like we should, yes, indeed.
And as a nice to have, it also won the Marketing Society Excellent Awards for Marketing and Shoestring.
That
and a couple
clearly
of
was
D&AD awards too.
the greater achievement, obviously. I jest. Mark, you work, well, I suppose by comparison with a relatively big brand, certainly with a bigger budget, I imagine anyway, I haven't seen your financials, than £15,000 for marketing activity. Obviously, but I know at Pret you choose not to spend millions and millions on above the line, to use what is probably now a hoary old phrase. I mean, why? If you could talk to us about why you chose perhaps not to put all your marketing budget there, and what you chose to put it into, and what kind of returns that you've got from the methods that you've used in regards to media allocation or channel allocation, even.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think the best way to answer that question is to just take a step back and ask ourselves what we mean by marketing investment. And what we try and do at Pret, and what I've experienced with other smaller or more challenger brands that I've worked with, is you need a very holistic definition of marketing. There's only so many lines within the P&L of a business that you can afford to invest in. And I think if you observe many big brands, they tend to invest very little in their product, and then an awful lot in actually promoting their product. And what we try and do at Pret is say, well, what are the things that really matter to customers? And those are areas where we should be making aggressive investment and long-term investment. So the type of things that we would classify as marketing investment are the quality of the ingredients, the number of team members that are on the tills in our shop at a given time, so that we can serve people more quickly, higher animal welfare standards for our ingredients. We also make a big effort to invest in technology. But again, it's less about media, it's just about which technology and use of technology really matters to customers. So the biggest investment we made 2 years ago was in our till systems and an upgrade on the payment technology so that we could take contactless payment at an even faster pace than our competitors at the time. And we now have nearly 70% of our card transactions are contactless. And it's a good fit for Pret, because Pret's for busy people on the go, wanting to get their lunch or coffee at speed. And customers really value the speed of service and in and out. So, I mean, I see that as a marketing investment. I think the marketing industry would go, well, that's an IT investment. That's not for us to influence. So I think getting hold, as a marketer, getting hold of as much of the budget as you possibly can by looking at the business and saying, well, what are those things that really are important to customers, and how can we as a marketing team influence those things? All of a sudden, you can actually have quite a large budget. So the design of the shops, the packaging, quality of the team members and the training that they have, all of those things impact the customer's impression of the brand. So that's where we choose to make most of our investments. And I think too often marketing teams and agencies, and it's no one's fault, it's just the way that our industry has been set up, I think. We spend all of our time running new campaigns and promotions, and everyone's massively busy working very, very hard on that. And often I think as client-side marketing teams, are we spending enough time thinking about the product itself before we even begin to market it? So is it as good as it possibly can be, and have we presented it as well as we might? And if I look at my earlier experience at Green and Blacks and now working with brands like Corsten Press and Union Hand Roasted Coffee, they don't have big advertising budgets at all, but they spend a disproportionate amount of their overall investment on the quality of their product and its presentation. And that's actually harder work, making sure you've got a product or an offering that in itself is differentiated. But we're really blessed now in the modern world of social media and a very transparent world that if you have got authentic differentiation, news tends to spread. So I would say our job as if you're trying to get more for your marketing budget, is to make sure that your product or service is as good as it possibly can be and as differentiated as it can be, and then be really, really clear about who you're targeting. And again, I think often as marketeers, we say that we know who we're targeting, but do we really know? Are we really precise about it? Because the more precise you can be, the lower levels of waste there will be in any marketing budget or spend that you do choose to invest behind.
So it's like a case of, well, marketing fundamentals, really. It'll never catch on, Mark. You're talking far too much. So you know, instead of thinking about the execution as the ultimate goal, it's about investing in the product, in the service, in the orientation, in understanding your customers. Yeah,
that's how I see it. And I also think it's really important to pick a few things. You can't do everything. You have to say, here are the areas we're going to actively invest behind. And I think brands really benefit when companies spend time worrying about what those things are, and then they invest in them over many, many years rather than chopping and changing each and every time they do brand planning. You know, you really have to say, what are the things that will set us apart in the long run? Then you get the cumulative benefit of consistent investment behind those things. And again, as an industry, sometimes I think we are guilty of chopping and changing. New brand manager, new agency, everybody wants to make their mark, do something different to last year. And actually, I think it is a skill to just work out what actually is working and really nurture it rather than feel obliged to change it. And it's probably less fashionable to do that, but I do think that's how you get a better return on investment.
Thank you. Graham, British Library is a fantastic product, great awareness, wonderful proposition, but I'm imagining you are faced with some of the same constraints in terms of getting that message out there that perhaps Tom is at Amnesty. So what kind of approach have you taken there?
Yeah, it feels like the same challenge. Or very
James Brown as your backdrop.
Similar challenge. Yeah, it sounds fun next door. The context for us is this kind of seismic shift, I suppose, from paid media through to owned and earned media. And really, at the British Library, the turnaround, if you like, has been in recognizing that that's a good thing for us. The British Library was never going to spend its way to marketing success, ever. Even in the old world, when, well, you know, in the Mad Men world, where you knew that attention had a price and you paid that price and didn't matter if half of it was wasted, that was just factored into the cost. That was never going to work for the British Library. So seeing this shift through to owned and earned media as a positive thing has enabled us to take a completely different approach, I suppose, to some of our most marketable products. And really, what I'm talking about there are things like major exhibitions. So, for example, 2015, yes, last year was a Magna Carta anniversary, 800 years or something since the signing of Magna Carta. It was a big year for the British Library. You know, it's pretty home territory for us. We should be, inverted commas, owning that space. So we really wanted to see if we could shift the balance a bit from the traditional arts and heritage exhibition copy and paste marketing plan, which is very out of home based. You know, it's all suburban cross tracks and London Underground posters and so on. So we tried to really kind of sweat the owned and the earned media more than we have ever done, really. So about a year out, we created a website. We call it a web space just for internal reasons, avoiding sort of kind of micrositing, siloing. So we created this really small Magna Carta web space. When I say small, it probably 4 articles, you know, interpretation of Magna Carta with, I don't know, probably a dozen digitized collection items. So the original Magna Carta, digitized, high definition, there on the web for anybody who wanted to see it. Not a huge investment in time, and certainly not a huge investment in money. Probably took about 2 weeks end to end to put it all together, and enabled us to start building up the audience for what we knew was going to happen a year later, 12 months out. So we started to really work our SEO on the Magna Carta website, and by the time the exhibition came around, we've got 50 to 100,000 people monthly visiting that web space. So that's an audience that we can then go into kind of conversion mode on. And then on the earned media, we really tried to pedal a bit faster on that as well by thinking about what we can do pre-opening. We don't just want to go surprise, you know, here's an exhibition, we've been working on it for a year, and now it's open, you can come and visit it. So about 3 months out, we staged a reunification. There are actually, believe it or not, four original versions of the Magna Carta from 1215 still in existence today. 2 of them at the British Library, one's at Lincoln Cathedral, one's at Salisbury Cathedral. So we brought them together for a one-off reunification event to mark the occasion, and we tried to build media and public interest around that. And so that obviously involves our press and comms team, and, you know, big media outlets like the BBC. And that was great. People loved it. This is a kind of historic moment, really, and a one-off opportunity to see something that's never happened before. And if you for a Magna Carta geek, that you're just not going to miss that. And it's an opportunity to up the ante before opening and put 50, 60,000 names, qualified names, into a database that can then be used later on in your e-marketing programs. So that's what we've tried to do. We've really tried to make this, to go with this seismic shift from paid advertising towards owned and earned. And on that occasion, although we had the wind in our sails, it was a great it was a great moment in history. We really made the most of it. We doubled our previous best ever exhibition attendance, so it was pretty successful by our standards.
Thank you, Mark. Coming back down the line, I mean, you've worked for Burger King in the past. You worked for Cadbury, organisations that do spend a lot of money on all aspects of marketing, but particularly in terms of multi-channel Marcoms campaigns. If you compare that experience with more recent experience, can it be a hindrance? Does it sort of force marketers to be lazy if they have a lot of money to spend on media on occasions, do you think?
Yes. The short
right, we'll
answer
move on.
to that. I think it's not necessarily lazy, but I think the minute you have the annual promotional calendar with advertising and below-the-line activity, etc., you're just incredibly busy as a client and agency team just executing that plan. There's nothing wrong with that, but you do have to ask, is anybody taking a step back and really thinking about what they're doing, or are they just so deep in execution that they're not thinking about the wider marketing mix? So I do think it brings its dangers, and people are sometimes frightened to just step out of that cycle. And you see it with discounting or vouchers, you see it in the casual dining and the restaurant space, that the drug of sales promotion. And the problem is that the marketers and the sales directors are just terrified to stop it, because on their watch they'll suddenly have a dip in sales. And I think that requires very mature leadership from the company, from the CEO and the finance director, to actually you can't cut people slack forever, but they do need to understand that you can't have your cake and eat it. If you're going to step off the treadmill of those activities, you probably will see a softer sales line, but probably much better brand health in the long term. But marketeers need air cover from the financial people in the business if they're to do that. And I think the problem far too often is they're not given that protection. So that's what's required.
And Tom, in regards to, I guess I'm asking both for your opinion. I don't know whether you can make the comparison, but you're trying to do, well, maybe you're not. I mean, you're both, everybody on this panel is looking to drive emotion. Obviously, you've got a very emotive, or a number of them very emotive causes. I mean, does that help in terms of persuasion, and therefore you don't have to shout as loud, do you think?
Well, it means we've got a pre-existing engaged audience that we can talk to and we can engage with, and then we can, rally. But it's not a big enough audience to be able to kind of make the type of noise that we achieved last year with the Arms Fair. So we specifically wanted to go beyond some of those existing supporters. We did utilise our existing supporters, so we kind of gave them a forewarning of the campaign we were about to run. We asked them to amplify the campaign through, if they came across the adverts in the newspapers or they saw the adverts on the street, to then share that on social. So we did use that, but we also wanted to ensure that we got beyond that in order to reach the wider audiences that we achieved there. So then it was about us, identifying those audiences and then providing the right content to get out there and to keep the story going, really.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'm going to cut to questions, if you could put those up on the screen from Slido, because we've got quite a few coming in. I can see them here, so I'll read them off. We're a relatively cosy, small little room, so why don't we perhaps think about, analog, old-fashioned, sticking your hand up. If you've got any questions, then stick your hand up as well and I'll come to you. Or you could do it all through the intimacy of a computer or a mobile phone screen. Up to you, your call. I'll start with you on this question, Mark. What's the least you've ever spent on a successful campaign? I suppose you need to define success first, but it's an interesting one.
Okay.
Don't know if you can actually quote numbers, but
I'm going to delve back through the years for this one. So I think at Green and Blacks we ran a campaign which started out as a recruitment need, in that we had a guy who's in charge of our recipe development, who's an incredibly talented foodie, who was responsible for how good Green and Blacks tastes. And But all of a sudden we realized as a business that what would happen if, God forbid, he left the company and the workload was just very intense. So we decided that we'd hire a deputy head of taste, and we put quite a bit of effort into doing a beautiful recruitment ad, and we posted it online, and it just captured the imagination as a PR story. So it became a headline story on the BBC News at 10, in that it was the best job currently in the UK was to taste chocolate for green and blacks. And I think we spent total on that campaign probably a couple of £1,000 on the creative, and then sadly a few thousand more pounds on actually hiring the person when we found them. But again, it's a good example of if you've got an interesting story, what started out as almost a recruitment need became a marketing campaign, not necessarily by design, but it's things that interest people will always get shared. And it goes back to my earlier point, really. Have a look at everything the business is doing as a marketeer and see where you can influence it, because a lot of those things, there's budgets that exist everywhere in businesses, and usually the biggest budgets are outside of the marketing department. So if you can actually stick your nose in and grab their budgets and brand them, you can get a much bigger overall campaign. So that's probably the most effective, low-cost one. And Veggie Pret that we've done recently, which is a pop-up shop, cost a few more £1,000s than that, but relatively cheap in the scheme of things. And the reason that's been successful, terrific PR for the brand, positioning it as a contemporary brand, forward-thinking brand, but more importantly, it's provided a absolute pipeline of new product development that we can now apply to the rest of the shops. So by having a dedicated vegetarian shop, our food development team have had to work at breakneck speed to fill that store with vegetarian recipes. They've done an awesome job.
Thanks for that. I appreciate that the question that is exclusively for Tom is the one with the most likes, but I'm either going to save that one or you can ask him personally at the end. So I want to try and bring Graham back into this one. Oh, this moving at a fast rate. Elise, there you are, right at the top now. How important is it to stay true to your brand DNA and not do everything versus to trying to keep up with all social platforms that are available for £1? So I suppose, in other words, stay true to your brand and don't go chasing the shiny new sexy stuff that might have absolutely nothing to do with the promise you're trying to deliver. Graham.
Yeah, I suppose it's always easier to swim with the tide, isn't it? It's easier for me at the British Library to push English literature or medieval history. It's much harder to push business support, because you don't really associate business support or startups or entrepreneurialism with any library, let alone the British Library. And yet that's one of our frontline products and services. So it's easy to go with your brand DNA, but you don't always have that luxury. And when you don't, then you have to work a lot harder, and that's kind of the point of this session in a way. And I think Russell mentioned it already. When you haven't got any money, you have to work harder. So what money buys you is extra resource and extra time and extra brain power, as well as extra media. But that's kind of the lesser of the 3 or 4 things in a way. So if you haven't got any money and you're having to swim against the tide, then you just have to work much, much harder. So, particularly on targeting, and if you want to get your targeting right without breaking the bank, then you can do that now. You can do micro targeting on social media where you're just spending a few quid, and then you can test your campaigns out. There's one of the biggest SEO conferences is Brighton SEO. It was last month, and there's an anecdote going around down there about this guy in America who wanted to test out micro-targeting. So he basically got his target segment on Facebook down to one individual, and he basically followed his roommate around the internet, targeting with this ad, saying,
"Is that targeting or stalking?"
Yeah, I know what you did at lunchtime. I know what you did, yesterday, and to the extent that his roommate got understandably paranoid and started throwing away his phone. He thought the FBI were after him and all sorts. But the point, so it's a great anecdote. But the point is, it costs nothing to do that, or almost nothing to do that, and you can prove the effectiveness of your messaging in the process.
Thank you. I think we've only got a couple of minutes left, so questions are moving around a lot. There was one directly for you, Tom, another one directly for you, but it's disappeared from the screen. So let me finish with this question at the top, which can be all things to all people. What has been your best and worst campaign and why? You can choose best or worst, but we'll have to be brief. Let me start with you, Tom. Well, I suppose maybe you've just answered.
I'm going to say best because it's the one I've talked about, because it's one where, with relatively little investment of money financially, but what was backed up was by a high investment in terms of staff resources. So, and this is something I haven't touched on. We work on so many wide issues all the time, but because this seemed like a really strategic issue to work on at the right time, it was topical, it was getting in the media, we knew that we could amplify that. We made a decision, organisationally, strategically, to pull together a lot of the physical resources within the organisation to come behind this one campaign. So low money, but I, as a campaign manager, could call on people in our digital team, in our press team, in our, an advocacy team. I could pull together all those resources to come behind me to work on this campaign. And it had a fantastic result.
Thank you. Mark, quickly, a success story or cautionary tale? The choice is yours.
I think I've talked about a couple that were good ones for modest budgets. I think some of the earlier work that I did with Union Coffee, which is a fantastic business. Thankfully, we've got a professional marketeer at Union Coffee rather than me doing it part-time. But we tried to do some advertising about 4 or 5 years ago, but we had such a small budget that we spent too much on production. And the creative idea was beautiful, but it was a timely reminder that you need big media to really extrapolate it. So I would say the return on investment on that initiative was very, very poor, and it was a good reminder not to try and do what the big guys do, but with a lower budget production. Stick to actually telling your story and not reverting to bigger company tactics. So that was not my finest hour.
Graham?
I would like us never to do any campaigns ever again, if I'm honest. I'd like to get out of that culture where you do something for 6 weeks or 8 weeks and then you've done it and then you go on to something else and you forget about it forever. I'd like to, picking up on what Mark was saying about giving marketers some air cover, I'd like us to take a longer term view about what's important and the value of what we do, so that you're measuring these things over 3 years or 5 years instead of 6 or 8 weeks. So I think that kind of campaign culture that we've all grown up in it's a bit of a problem for me today.
Thank you very much. Join me in thanking Graham, Mark and Tom for a fantastic session. We've covered a lot in a short space of time. I hope you can go away with just maybe one of those experiences as a nugget to help you do what you do that bit better, and maybe spend less money, who knows. Thanks very much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.